What's going on, guys? CTA Prime back here again. Today I'm going to build a really awesome little gaming machine. Now, I've been wanting to do this for a little while, so I kind of got the idea to build this for my wife, but don't tell her that I'm actually building this so I can see how it performs. But I'm able to get away with this by building it for her. So this is going to be an all AMD build, 8 cores, 16 threads with the all new 5700 XT GPU. This is a build I've been wanting to put together for a little while, and I finally get the chance to do it, and I can also use it for a few days before I hand it over. So before we get to the build and testing, I do want to go over the parts used in this setup. So first things first, the CPU. I originally wanted to go with a 3rd gen Ryzen, but I found a really good deal on the 2700. This is the non-X variant. I got this for $160 on Newegg, and I couldn't pass it up. 8 cores, 16 threads, a base clock of 3.2 GHz, and a boost of 4.1. The motherboard I'm using for this build is an X570, so if I ever want to upgrade to a 3rd gen Ryzen down the road, I can always do that, and I probably will when the price drops on those 3rd gens. To keep the temps down on that 2700, I opted for an all-in-one liquid cooler. This is the H100i Pro. I actually have the same setup in my own PC, and that thing's rocking a 9600K at 5.1 GHz. Never had any trouble, so I think we'll be able to keep this pretty cool. As for the motherboard, this is the ASRock Phantom Gaming ITX TB3, so it does have Thunderbolt 3 built in. This is an X570 chipset, so like I mentioned, if I ever wanted to upgrade to a 3rd gen down the road, I'll have no trouble doing it with this board. This little mini ITX board actually has some really awesome cooling on the VRM, so if I ever want to overclock the 2700 or down the road when I upgrade, I should have no issues at all. It actually has a built-in fan and heat pipe for the VRM, so overclocking should be a breeze with this. But I think the best thing about this board is the bracketing system used for the CPU. Instead of using an AM4 bracketing system, they're using an Intel bracketing system, 1150X or 1155, 1150, 1151. Any of those will fit here. And in my experience, there's so many more Intel coolers out there than AM4 right now, and I think this is an awesome option that they did. Especially if you want to use this board for a super small form factor build, because you can find really awesome low profile Intel coolers all over the place. I'll be using 16 gigabytes of Team Force Vulcan Z RAM, clocked at 3200 megahertz out of the box. For storage, a 500 gigabyte Crucial SSD, this is an MX500, and a good old Western Digital 1 terabyte blue hard drive. I was planning on doing an M.2 in this setup, but when I ordered it, they sent me the wrong size, and it's going to take a week to get it, so I figured I'd go ahead and skip that. I can use that M.2 in another build down the road. The GPU is something that I'm really excited about because I really haven't had a chance to mess around with the new AMD 5700 series, so I opted for the ASRock Taichi 5700 XT. Now this card on paper looks like it'll handle pretty much anything we want to throw at it, but we have to get into testing to really find out. This has a base clock of 1885 MHz, a boost clock of 2040 MHz, and 8 GB of 256-bit GDDR6 RAM. To power everything, I went with a Corsair CX750M. This is a semi-modular power supply, and I have used this exact model in the past with no troubles at all. And finally, holding everything together is the Dark Flash DLM21. Now, I never spend over $60 on a PC case. That's just my preference. I'd like to keep it under $40, but this was $59 on Amazon, and I really love the look of it. It's compatible with mini ITX or micro ATX motherboards, and it has this hinged tempered glass side panel. I just really love the look of this case. So now it's time to get into the build. We're just going to go over this real quick because I'm really interested to see how this thing performs. Alright, so let's go ahead and get this motherboard ready. I'm just going to install the CPU and the RAM because I'm going to mount this in the case before I do the cooling system. Very easy to do. We're just going to drop the CPU down, lock it in place, and now it's time for the RAM. This is a 16 gigabyte kit, so I have two 8 gig sticks. Just make sure I'm putting them in the correct way and lock them down. Like I mentioned, this motherboard has some serious cooling on the VRM, some of the best I've seen out of a mini ITX. We have the heatsink here along with a fan, and the heat pipe is actually coming from the back plate. The whole back plate is aluminum, and that's what's really cooling those VRMs. Now it's time to mount the motherboard in the case. This does support mini ITX, which I have here, or micro ATX, and the standoffs were already set up for mini ITX right out of the box, so I didn't have to do anything there. I'm just going to drop it down and screw it in. I was a little hesitant to purchase a Dark Flash case. I've never used them in the past, but this thing looks very well built, and the cable management should be outstanding in this thing. With the motherboard mounted, I figured I'd go ahead and plug in all of the case wiring, power button, reset button, LEDs, and USB in the front. It's now time to install the Corsair H100i all-in-one liquid cooler. Keep in mind that even though I'm building an AMD system, this ASRock motherboard uses an Intel mounting system for the cooler, so there's a lot more options, and it does make life easier because a lot of the times they're set up for Intel right out of the box, just like this H100. I mounted the radiator in the top section of the case. I was going to go with the front, but the graphics card that I have here is a bit long and it just wouldn't allow me to place it there. This AIO does come with two nice Corsair fans, and I'm going to set this up in a pull configuration. So it's going to be pulling air from the top of the case across the radiator, and then we're going to exhaust it right out of the back. So I've got the radiator and the pump mounted. It's time to install the power supply. This case does have a hard drive / power supply basement, so we're going to slide it in right through the back here, secure it with 4 screws, and then we'll get it all wired up. Besides cable management and mounting my SSD and hard drive, all that's left to do is install the GPU. Now this thing is pretty big. This is a beefy card, and it hardly fits in here with the 2 fans that I have in the front of the case. Now one thing I'd like to do down the road is get some type of GPU bracketing system, because this is a really long card, and I think over time we will get some sag out of it. And even while securing it in the case, I did want to kind of prop it up, so I just used a pair of pliers here, just to hold it up while I put the screws in. So overall, the build went pretty smooth. Cable management in this case is much better than I thought, and I wouldn't mind doing another build in one of these. I really do like this case, especially at $60. So I believe I have everything in place. It's time to boot it up for the first time. I'm personally not a big fan of RGB, but I do like what the GPU is doing inside of the case here, so I might turn off the cooler's light and just leave the GPU on. Alright, so the build's finished. I just need to install Windows 10 Pro and get this thing up and running. Alright, so here we are. I've installed Windows 10 Pro, bunch of applications and games to test here. Ryzen 7 2700, this is that 8-core CPU with 16 threads, 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 MHz RAM, and the Radeon RX 5700 XT. So the first thing I did was run a few tests with 3D Mark. First up, we have Time Spy. Total score 8,960, graphics score 9,289, CPU 7,466. Beat out 81% of all results. Next up, Firestrike 1.1, total score of 18,422, graphics score 27,738, physics score 17,887, and combined 5,303. Beat out 89% of all results. So far, it's been working pretty good. The CPU and GPU temps are right on spot, just as I expected. I was actually expecting the GPU to get a little hotter than it is, but I haven't overclocked anything yet. The next test I ran was a quick Geekbench. This is actually Geekbench 4, single core, 4,530, multi, 23,714. I also did a quick Blender render test. This is the BMW test, CPU only. The Ryzen 2700, 1 minute and 2 seconds. The Ryzen 2600 was around 1 minute and 48. And the Ryzen 3400G with the built-in Radeon graphics, 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Those extra cores and threads on the 2700 is really helping out with these render tests. Next up, we have Cinebench R15, Ryzen 2700, 1546, the Ryzen 2600, 1263, and that Ryzen 3400G, 834. And keep in mind, all of these tests are performed with the stock base clock of 3.2 GHz and a boost of 4.1. I've successfully overclocked a 2700 to 4 GHz on all 8 cores in the past, and it'll definitely help out with all of these tests. Now it's time to move over to a little bit of gaming. Now all the tests you see on screen here are at 1080p, either ultra or very high settings, depending on what settings are in the menu. First up, we have GTA 5, 1080p, very high, no MSAA. I'm getting an average of 98 FPS. This is totally playable. Next up, we have Project Cars 2, 1080p, ultra settings, no MSAA, getting an average of 103 FPS. And keep in mind, when you turn weather on and a lot of rain, it's going to drop down into the 70s. Here's CSGO, 1080p, high settings. By the end of this match, I was getting around 169 average FPS. And finally, for the demoed gameplay, we have Doom, Ultra settings, 1080p using the Vulcan backend. Unfortunately, Afterburner wouldn't stay on screen, but it did log for me, and we got an average of 197 FPS. I went through and tested a bunch of different games, some new stuff, some old stuff at 1080p, 1440, and 4K. Here's the results. And one that kind of blew me away was League of Legends. I know this is an older game, but at 1080p ultra settings, I got an average of 537 FPS. 1440p was still great at 314, and even 4K at 132 FPS. One thing I like to monitor with these power-hungry machines is power consumption from the wall. I'm using a kilowatt meter. Idle, 67 watts, 4K gaming, 314 watts, and my extreme test, which consists of running Prime 95 and 3D Mark Time Spy at the same time, 433 watts from the wall. So this machine can definitely pull some power, and when I do some overclocking to the CPU and GPU, it's only going to get worse. So what did this build cost? Well, I kind of overspent on a few of these parts, like the motherboard, the cooler, and even the GPU. Now, if I had to do this again for myself, I would have went with a lower end motherboard. I would have alleviated the Corsair H100i because the Ryzen 2700 does come with a cooler in the box, and I would have went with a cheaper 5700 XT or maybe even the 5700. But for this build, total cost on everything here, $1,309. But going with some lower end parts, you could bring this down to around $950. And yes, in my opinion, all of this stuff is overpriced. There are thousands and thousands of different combinations that you can do when building a PC. You can build anything from $300 on up to $50,000 if you want to. You kind of got to find the sweet spot for your budget, but this was a gift and I kind of wanted to go all out with it, and I think I did a pretty good job. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I really appreciate you watching. If you're interested in building something similar, I will leave links to Amazon in the description. Keep in mind that prices are subject to change, and some of this stuff I kind of sat on for a little while. When I found a good deal, I would pick it up, knowing that I had a build coming up. If you have any questions, or you want to see anything else running or tested on this build, just let me know in the comments below. It'd be really cool if you could hit that like button, or maybe subscribe to the channel. But like always, thanks for watching.